The John Deere salesman leaned against the showroom doorframe, arms crossed, watching me load the 1952 Farmall Super M onto my flatbed trailer. His smirk said everything he was thinking without him having to say a word. "That's what your grandpa left you." He finally laughed out loud, shaking his head like he'd just heard the funniest joke of his life. "Kid, I got payment plans that'll put you in a real tractor. Something from this century. Hell, something from this decade." I didn't answer him. Just secured the chains tighter around the old red machine and kept working. Let him laugh. Let him think whatever he wanted to think. My name's Tom Brennan. I'm 34 years old, and 3 weeks ago, my grandfather passed away on his farm just outside Springfield, Illinois. Raymond Brennan, 89 years old when he went, spent every single day of his life on that same piece of land his father bought back in 1928. I'd been living in Chicago for 12 years at that point, working in commercial real estate. Good job, good apartment, good life by most people's standards. But I always felt like something was missing. Like I'd left a part of myself behind when I left the farm for college. Grandpa and I had talked on the phone every Sunday evening for as long as I could remember. Even when I was traveling for work. Even when I was too busy to call anyone else. Sunday evenings at 6 o'clock, my phone would ring, and it would be him wanting to know how my week had gone. He never made me feel guilty about leaving. Never said I should have stayed and farmed. He'd just ask about my job, my life, my plans, and then he'd tell me stories about the farm, about the weather, about what he was working on, about the tractors. He talked about that Super M sometimes, never made a big deal about it, just mentioned it in passing. How it still started every time. How the engine ran smooth. How he'd spent a Saturday afternoon changing the oil even though he hadn't actually driven it in years. I should have paid more attention, should have asked more questions, but I was always rushing to the next thing, the next meeting, the next deal. The lawyer read the will in Grandpa's living room on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The whole family showed up. My cousins, my aunts, my uncles, everyone waiting to see what they'd get from a lifetime of Raymond Brennan's hard work. My cousins, Derek and Michelle, got the house and the land. 400 acres of prime Illinois farmland. My Aunt Susan got the newer John Deere equipment, the trucks, the implements. My uncle got the livestock and the grain storage, and me. I got one single item, the 1952 Farmall Super M, sitting in the back corner of Grandpa's oldest barn, covered in 30 years of dust and oil stains. My cousin Derek actually laughed out loud when the lawyer read that part. "Enjoy your scrap metal, Tom. Maybe you can sell it for parts and buy yourself a nice dinner." Everyone else just looked uncomfortable. I'd always been the one who didn't farm. The one who went to college in Chicago. The one who worked in an office instead of behind a plow. The one who came home maybe twice a year if I could fit it into my schedule. So yeah, I completely understood why everyone thought Grandpa giving me that old tractor was either a joke or an insult, maybe both. But I remembered something nobody else seemed to remember. When I was 8 years old, Grandpa took me out to that barn on a summer evening, pulled the dusty tarp off that Super M. The red paint was faded and worn, but you could still make out the word Farmall across the grill in those classic white letters. "This tractor," he told me, putting his weathered hand on my small shoulder, "is special. Don't you ever forget that, Tom." I asked him why it was special. What made this one different from all the other tractors he owned? He just smiled that knowing smile of his and said, "You'll know when the time comes, son. You'll know." So when that John Deere dealer stood there mocking me, I didn't take the bait. I just drove that Super M home to my garage in Springfield and started trying to figure out what Grandpa had meant all those years ago. The first thing that surprised me was that the engine actually turned over. After sitting for who knows how long, I expected it to be seized up completely, but it fired right up after a few tries. The carburetor was surprisingly clean. The oil looked like it had been changed relatively recently. Somebody had been maintaining this machine even though it hadn't been used in years. I started going through Grandpa's old papers that my aunt had boxed up and given me. Birth certificates, property deeds, tax records, going back decades. And then I found it. A black and white photograph from 1952. A much younger Raymond Brennan, maybe 30 years old, standing proud as could be, next to a brand new Farmall Super M. On the back of the photo, in his distinctive handwriting, he'd written, "First tractor I ever bought with my own money, paid cash. Never forget this day, June 15th, 1952. That's when I noticed something that made my heart start racing. The serial number, visible in the photograph, matched exactly the serial number on the tractor sitting in my garage. This wasn't just any old Super M. This was Grandpa's very first tractor. The one he'd bought as a young man with money he'd saved working 3 different jobs. I called a buddy of mine named Frank, who restores antique farm equipment over in Decatur. Asked him if he'd mind coming to take a look at something. He showed up the next afternoon, walked around the Super M twice without saying a word, then suddenly stopped, cold, and got down on his hands and knees. "Tom," he said slowly, "do you have any idea what you've got here?" I shrugged. "A 50-year-old Farmall that my grandpa kept for sentimental reasons." Frank pointed to something I'd never noticed before. A small brass plate, maybe 3 inches wide, riveted to the frame near the engine block. Most of it was covered in decades of grime and oil. He pulled out a rag and carefully cleaned it off. The engraved text became visible. Prototype Unit 003, International Harvester, Experimental Division, 1951. Frank's hands were actually shaking as he stood back up. His face had gone completely white. "This isn't a production model," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is one of the original test units. International Harvester only made 5 of these before they finalized the Super M design for mass production. As far as I know, the other 4 were all scrapped or destroyed in testing." "What are you saying?" I asked him. "I'm saying this might be the only prototype Super M left in existence. This thing is absolutely priceless. Museum quality. Collectors all over the world would kill to own this." I still didn't fully believe him. It seemed impossible. How could Grandpa have owned something this valuable and never mentioned it to anyone? How could he have kept it hidden for all those years? Frank spent the next 2 hours going over every inch of that tractor with me. He showed me modifications that were unique to the prototype units. A different casting on the transmission housing, a slightly modified governor system. Even the wheel hubs were a different design than what eventually went into production. He took probably 100 photographs, measured everything, made detailed notes. He told me he knew a guy at the International Harvester Museum in Chicago who would absolutely lose his mind over this. That night, after Frank left, I sat in my garage, just staring at the Super M, thinking about Grandpa, driving it across those fields, year after year. Thinking about him keeping this secret, thinking about why he chose to leave it to me, instead of one of my cousins who actually farmed. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Derek and Michelle would have seen it as just another piece of equipment, something to use or sell. They wouldn't have questioned it, wouldn't have investigated. They would have scrapped it or sold it to some random buyer for a few $1,000s without ever knowing what it really was. But Grandpa knew me. Knew I'd be curious. Knew I'd dig deeper. Knew I'd want to understand the story behind it. He'd planned this whole thing. I thought he was exaggerating. I really did. But he made some phone calls right there in my garage. Within 48 hours, I had 3 different agricultural museums contacting me. Then a historian from Iowa State University. Then a private collector from Dallas who told me he'd been searching for a prototype Super M for over 20 years. The offers started coming in. $20,000, then $50,000. Then someone offered $100,000. Each call was more surreal than the last. One collector from Tennessee explained to me that he'd spent 15 years trying to authenticate rumors that any of these prototype units had survived. He'd traveled to salvage yards across 7 states. He'd interviewed retired International Harvester engineers. He'd gone through company archives. And here I was, with one sitting in my suburban garage. A museum curator from Minnesota told me they'd pay $200,000 just for the right to study it for 6 months before I sold it to anyone else. They wanted to document every modification, every unique feature, everything that made it different from the production models. The Smithsonian rep I spoke with, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, told me she'd been working in agricultural history for 28 years and had never seen anything like this come available. She said most people don't understand how rare agricultural artifacts of this caliber really are. She compared it to finding an original Wright Brothers aircraft component or a prototype Ford Model T. But I told every single one of them no. Not because I was holding out for more money, but because I needed to understand why Grandpa never told anyone about this, why he kept it hidden in the back of his barn, why he left it specifically to me. I went back to his farmhouse. My cousins had already cleared out most of the furniture and personal belongings, getting ready to sell the place. But I remembered Grandpa had a hiding spot in the attic, a loose floorboard where he used to keep important papers. The house felt different, empty. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. The walls where family photos had hung for decades now showed faded rectangles of darker paint. The kitchen, where Grandma used to make Sunday dinners, was stripped bare. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air up there was hot and still, full of dust that caught the afternoon sunlight coming through the small window. I could hear the house settling, those old timber beams creaking the way they always had. I found the board right where I remembered. 3rd row from the west wall, 4 boards in from the south side. I'd watched him hide things there when I was a kid, though he'd never told me what. I pried it up with a screwdriver I'd brought from my truck, and there was the old metal lockbox I'd never seen before. It was one of those fire-safe boxes from the 1960s, dark green, with a simple key lock that had been left open. Inside was a single envelope with my name written on it in his distinctive handwriting, the same handwriting I'd seen on 1,000 birthday cards and Christmas letters over the years. My hands shook as I opened it and started reading. Tom, if you're reading this, then you got the tractor like I planned. Good, you're the only one in this family who'll understand what I'm about to tell you. I bought that machine in the spring of 1952 with money I'd saved working at the grain elevator, the gas station, and doing carpentry on weekends. 3 jobs for 2 years straight. The dealer, a man named Howard Pinsky, told me it was an experimental unit. Said International Harvester was testing new designs, and they were selling off a few of the prototypes cheap because they might not hold up long term. Most farmers wouldn't touch them. Too risky. But I took the chance because it was all I could afford. That tractor plowed every single field on this farm for the next 30 years. Never quit on me once, never broke down. It taught me something important that I want you to understand. Real value isn't in what's shiny and new. It's in what lasts. It's in what works when everything else fails. I'm giving this tractor to you because you left the farm, but you never forgot where you came from. You're the only one who won't just see it as a piece of old junk. Don't sell it unless you absolutely have to. But if you do decide to sell it, make damn sure it goes to someone who understands what it represents. It represents taking a risk when nobody else would. It represents trusting in something that hasn't been proven yet. It represents the value of what endures. I love you, Tom. I'm proud of the man you became, your grandfather, Raymond. I sat in that empty attic for over an hour, holding that letter, crying like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. 2 months went by. The offers kept coming. $250,000, $500,000. The Smithsonian even reached out through their agricultural history department. Then I got a call from Meckham Auctions. They were putting together a special vintage agriculture equipment sale in Indianapolis, biggest one in the country. They'd heard about the Super M through the collector network. They wanted it as the centerpiece of the entire auction. I thought about Grandpa's letter for a long time, thought about what he would want me to do. I finally said yes. The auction was scheduled for a Saturday in October. I hauled the Super M to Indianapolis myself, driving slowly the whole way, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The Meckham facility was enormous. Thousands of pieces of equipment staged for the sale. Combines, tractors, antique trucks, rare implements, but they gave the Super M a special spot, front and center on the main platform. The night before the auction, I walked through the empty hall, just me and that tractor under the spotlights. I put my hand on the same steering wheel Grandpa's hands had gripped for 30 years. I could almost feel him there with me. The next morning, the place filled up fast. I'd never seen so many serious collectors in one room. Men in expensive boots and designer jeans. Museum representatives with authentication equipment. International buyers on cell phones translating for clients in other countries. When they rolled the Super M onto the auction platform under those bright lights, you could hear the entire crowd go silent. Then the murmuring started. Collectors recognizing what they were looking at. Historians confirming it with each other. Museum curators making frantic phone calls. The auctioneer was a man named Dale Mitchum. Been doing farm equipment auctions for 40 years. He'd personally called me 3 times before the auction to make sure I understood what was about to happen. He said in all his years, he'd never sold anything like this. He stood at the podium and explained the history of the tractor, explained how rare it was, explained that this might be the only one left in the world. He talked about International Harvester's experimental division, talked about how most prototype equipment got scrapped or destroyed, talked about how this one had somehow survived and worked for 3 decades. Then he said something that surprised me. He told the story of Raymond Brennan, a young farmer who took a chance on an unproven machine when everyone else said no. A man who kept that machine running long after newer models came along. A man who understood that real value isn't about what's new, it's about what endures. Ladies and gentlemen, Dale said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. We'll start the bidding at $500,000. 3 paddles went up immediately. Within 30 seconds, the bid hit $2 million. At $5 million, there were only 3 bidders left. A private collector from Stuttgart, Germany, a representative from the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan, and a woman in the back representing the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. At 8 million, it was down to the German collector and the Smithsonian. The entire room had gone completely silent, except for Dale's voice calling out the escalating bids. 9 million. Do I hear 9.5? Yes, 9.5 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 10? 10 million from the Smithsonian. Do I hear 10.5? It kept climbing. 11 million, 11.5, 12 million. At 12 million, the German collector shook his head and sat down. The Smithsonian representative raised her paddle one final time. $12,300,000, Dale called out. Going once, going twice. Sold to the Smithsonian Institution. The gavel came down. I stood there in complete shock. My legs felt like they were going to give out. $12.3 million. For a tractor my grandfather bought for probably a few $1,000s in 1952. I didn't go back to that John Deere dealership to rub it in the salesman's face. Didn't need to. Didn't want to. But about 3 months later, I was at the local farm supply store buying some tools. That same dealer was there, picking up hydraulic filters. He saw me and just froze. We made eye contact. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I heard about the tractor, he said quietly, looking down at his boots, about what it sold for at auction. I just nodded. He hesitated for a long moment, then said, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have laughed at you that day. That was wrong of me. I shook my head. You didn't know what it was. Hell, neither did I, at the time. He looked up at me then. Your grandpa used to come into the dealership sometimes. Never bought anything new. Always said the old stuff was built better. I thought he was just being cheap. Thought he was just a stubborn old farmer who didn't want to spend money. He wasn't cheap, I told him. He was smart. He understood value in a way most people don't. The dealer nodded slowly, like he was really hearing that for the first time. Yeah, he said, I'm starting to understand that now. I left the store and drove past Grandpa's old farm on my way home. My cousins had sold it to a development company 6 weeks earlier. There were already construction crews out there, stakes in the ground, marking where new houses would go. The cornfields where Grandpa had worked his whole life were going to become a subdivision called Harvest Glen Estates. I pulled over on the side of the road and just sat there for a while, engine idling, looking at the land. The barn where I'd first seen the Super M was still standing, but it had a big orange demolition notice posted on the door. They'd be tearing it down within the month to make room for cookie-cutter houses that would sell for $500,000 each. I thought about all the hours Grandpa had spent on that land. All the seasons he'd watched come and go. All the harvests. All the hard decisions about whether to buy new equipment or make the old stuff last one more year. All the times he chose patience and maintenance over debt and upgrades. My cousin Derek called me that evening. First time we'd talked since the will reading. He'd heard about the auction through the farming community grapevine. Someone had sent him a link to the news article about the sale. The article had Grandpa's photo in it, the old one from 1952. Derek didn't apologize for laughing at me that day in the lawyer's office. Didn't congratulate me on the sale. Just said, I guess the old man knew what he was doing after all. Yeah, I told him, he always did. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear his kids playing in the background, his wife calling them to dinner. Normal family sounds. Then Derek said something that surprised me. Told me he was struggling with the farm. That the debt on the new John Deere equipment was crushing him. That corn prices had dropped, and he didn't know how he was going to make this year's payments. That he was thinking about selling some of the land Grandpa had left him just to stay afloat. I asked him if he'd ever considered going back to some of the old methods, running older equipment that was paid for, focusing on what works instead of what's newest and shiniest. He laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh this time, just tired, defeated, almost. He said, "You sound just like Grandpa now, you know that." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," I told him. The money from the auction changed my life in practical ways, paid off my condo, set up college funds for my future kids, gave me the freedom to maybe start my own business instead of working for someone else. But that wasn't the real inheritance. The real inheritance was understanding what Grandpa had been trying to teach me my whole life. That value isn't about the price tag, it's about what endures, what lasts, what you can count on when everything else fails. He'd given me that tractor knowing I'd dig deeper, knowing I'd ask questions, knowing I'd eventually understand. The Smithsonian put the Super M on permanent display in their agricultural history wing. They built a whole exhibit around it, spent 6 months restoring it to exactly how it would have looked in 1952 while preserving all the wear and patina from 30 years of actual farm use. They wanted people to see both the innovation and the endurance. There's a large informational plaque next to the tractor that tells its entire story. The plaque reads, "Farmall Super M, Prototype Unit 003, one of 5 experimental units produced by International Harvester in 1951, owned and operated by Raymond Brennan from 1952 to 1984. This tractor represents American agricultural innovation and the farmers who believed in untested technology when no one else would. It plowed the same Illinois farmland for 32 consecutive years without a single major mechanical failure, a testament to engineering excellence and the enduring spirit of American farming." They also included the photograph of young Raymond standing next to the tractor on that June day in 1952. The one where you can see the pride in his eyes. The one where he's holding the keys like they're made of gold. I visit it once a year, drive down to Washington, D.C., and spend an afternoon in that museum. Stand there, looking at Grandpa's tractor under those professional lights, surrounded by people who finally understand how special it really is. Last time I was there, a father was explaining the exhibit to his young son. The kid couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. The same age I was when Grandpa first showed me that tractor. The father was reading the plaque out loud, telling his son about how this farmer took a risk on something nobody else believed in, about how he kept it running long after everyone said he should upgrade, about how sometimes the old ways are the best ways, about how the machines they built back then were made to last, not made to break, so you'd have to buy another one. The kid looked up at his dad with those wide, curious eyes kids have, and asked, was he rich? The father smiled and shook his head. No, son, he was smart. There's a difference. Being rich is about how much money you have. Being smart is about how you use what you've got. I almost said something to them, almost introduced myself, and told them I was Raymond Brennan's grandson, that I knew him, that I'd learned from him, but I decided to just listen instead. To let Grandpa's story speak for itself the way he would have wanted. I walked around the exhibit one more time before leaving, read every information panel, looked at every photograph they'd included. There was one I hadn't seen before on this visit. Someone from the family must have donated it. It showed Grandpa as a much older man, maybe 70 or so, sitting on the Super M in front of the barn. He wasn't posing for the camera. Wasn't even looking at it. He was just sitting there, one hand on the wheel, looking out at his fields, the way he must have done 1,000 times before. That's the image I carry with me now. Not the tractor under museum lights. Not the auction, or the money, or any of that. Just Grandpa on his tractor, looking at his land, content with what he'd built, and how he'd built it. And every single time I'm there, standing in front of that exhibit, I hear Grandpa's voice in my head, as clear as if he was standing right next to me. The same words he said to me when I was 8 years old, standing in that dusty barn, looking at a machine I didn't understand yet. This tractor is special, Tom. Don't you ever forget that. I never will, Grandpa. I promise you, I never will.